I decided to call my truck Gary because I notice his engine shrinks when he gets cold. As most of you probably remember, and a few of you have probably forgotten, when I moved into this tiny house, I mentioned that it was never a part of my plan, but sometimes you get dealt a hand and you just have to go with it because you don't have many other choices. Well, before the real winter has actually arrived, before I could see if this tiny house would be warm enough when the temperatures went down to -20 or -30, something happened that's not going to surprise most of you. I was the first person to ever live in this tiny house, and I was made aware before I moved in by the owner that it probably will be warm enough for the coldest temperatures, but nobody is certain. And I accepted being the guinea pig because this was the best option that I had at that time. The temperatures finally reached down to around 0 degrees, and I could tell within minutes of waking up that the tiny house was not going to be warm enough if it got colder. In fact, it was barely warm enough when it was 0 degrees, and probably only because during the daytime it still gets up to the mid-teens now. In my previous videos, I had people suggesting to put certain things over the windows and to do other things that would cost me money but make the place warmer. And the reason I will not do any of those things is because this house is not my own, and I feel that that's the owner's responsibility if she wants to rent the place through the winter. I don't want to invest my own money into someone else's property. So what I decided to do was to go to one of my backup plans, and I will unfortunately be leaving this tiny house in the next couple of days. While living here for almost 2 months, I could have complained a lot about things like the steps, which I mentioned in the previous video. But I didn't do that because once you start becoming negative about the things you don't like, it makes it much easier for you to give up and leave, and I truly wanted this tiny house to stay warm enough through the winter because I learn a lot living in places like my summer cabin in this house, which benefits me for when I hopefully can get my own cabin or tiny house. So I'm really disappointed that I'm leaving here, and I think it's a shame they did not insulate this home better because both the renter and myself are losing out on something. They're losing out on money that they could have been getting for the next 2 years, and I'm losing out on learning more about what I should and shouldn't get, or should look for and shouldn't look for when I'm buying my own small home in Alaska. But I still have learned quite a bit, not only from this tiny house, but also from the summer cabin I rented, and that's a lot compared to what I knew last June. And the final question from the previous videos is, will I be looking for a tiny house or a cabin when I start looking for my own home to buy? And the answer is quite simple. It would be a cabin. Not only because there's a little more space, but there's nothing good from the cabin that I could put into a tiny house. But there are a few things from the tiny house that I could put into a cabin. For example, the larger windows in a tiny house would be ideal, in my opinion, to have in a cabin. But while here, I also realized what I thought I wanted in the past, which was to live in the forest far from town instead of living closer to town, is a bit inconvenient during the winter time, unless you don't mind driving on roads that are slick or may have black ice on them. So if it was my choice, I would rent a cabin closer to town. But that's something I'll talk about in the future. So for now, I apologize for those who started following the channel to see what it's like living in a tiny house, because this video is my final goodbye to what I once called a large microwave dinner box. I don't regret trying it out, and I wouldn't be leaving if it wasn't for the poor winter insulation, and I'm not too thrilled about where I'm moving to now. But sometimes you have to roll with the punches and spin like a top.